everyone. Today I would like to talk to you about the other side. Now, what we've been talking about so far in our topics has been the steps of how to do a penetration test or pen test. Now, in ethical hacking, one of the things that we have to think about is the other side of that and what can a company do to protect against some of the things that we've been talking about. So some of the things that we can do is we can look at detecting scans. In computers, we have something called an IDS or an IPS, an intrusion detection system, or an intrusion protection system. Now, the big difference is a detection system basically is the equivalent of help, help, something is going wrong. A protection system is help, help, something is going wrong, I'm going to go take care of it. So you can see the difference. Now, some of the things that we can do also to detect scans, we can actually have scripts. And what these scripts can do is tell the difference between a hacker, a legitimate user, and a search engine spider. Now, this can be difficult, especially as some of the hackers and spiders and bots are going to get more and more sophisticated. But we want to be able to tell, is this actually legitimate traffic or is this somebody scanning the system? And there's some behaviors that we can look at to be able to tell, oh, well, they're just, on our webpage and maybe confused versus, oh, they're on our webpage and trying to log in as our admin. That's not great. So that's the kind of thing that we can think about here. Snapshots will give us an idea of what is actually on the system. And we can start thinking about what is on here, what's set up, and has that changed. We can also have something called traps and triggers. The idea being we can have honey traps and canaries. And what we are doing when we talk about honey traps and canaries and other varieties of traps and triggers is we are trying to find ways to isolate what's going on and potentially stop the problem from continuing. So let's say, for example, we have a bot coming through scraping our website. Well, we can actually set a honey trap where that bot will basically go to an infinite number of generated URLs, so it'll get lost in all of those infinitely generated URLs. That's not something that a human would get lost in because a human would be able to tell what was going on if we've set up our trap correctly, but the bot would be able to get lost in there. And so we can have these different sort of tags around the system to be able to figure out if we have bots or scripts or things like that coming in and trying to scan us. Now, some other examples of traps. We might have text that is too small to read. We might have what's called a honey token. So this is info that seems really good but is actually fake. So like, for example, maybe we post our faked info in plain text. So somewhere in the HTML we have, admin and the password is password. Now, this isn't something a regular person is likely to go find, but that might be something that a bot would be likely to go find or a script would be likely to find. We can also do things with white on white text or black on black text, so it's things a human couldn't see, but a bot would be able to see. We can also have some crawler traps so that we can, as I had described before, set up something so that it's basically an infinite set of generated URLs. Now, some things you do need to be mindful of. Think about screen readers. Think about the ways that people use these websites. Not everybody is going to be coming to the website or looking at things on their desktops or laptops. People use phones and tablets and all kinds of stuff. People will also use screen readers, and you need to make sure that none of this is getting in the way of that. Now, let's look at a specific example of hiding emails on a website. So, one of the things that we can do to hide emails is actually use pictures. Now, one of the reasons that pictures have been popular for this is a human is able to look at the image and read the image very clearly. You can see I have my work email address up here. But a bot would look at this and just say, oh, well, that's a collection of pixels and continue on. Machine learning has made a lot of advances for computer vision and being able to detect what's going on in an image, but it's not at the same place that a human would be at. So we can do things like mask the at symbol with a picture of the at symbol. We can mask an email address with a picture of the email address. Again, you need to keep in mind accessibility. Anytime you're doing anything that's a little abnormal, make sure you're checking it against things like screen readers so that a screen reader could still read out this email address. We can do things like replace the mail to script. So in websites, we will sometimes have a mail to, and we could use other ways of disguising the email for that mail to. We could also place an email under that mail to that is basically a junk email. If only scripts and bots can read that email address, it can actually make a really good honey trap because you know that the only way somebody's sending email is if somebody scraped your site. You can do things like writing out emails. So if you spell out the at sign and the dot sign, so instead of just having the dot of a period, it was DOT. That can be another way that we can hide email addresses a little bit. A human would be able to, again, look at that and say, oh, well, that's obviously an email address. Anytime you have username with AT, URL, DOT, and then com, edu, whatever, that's something that a human would be able to say, oh, that's an email, but it's a lot harder for a script to be able to say that if somebody didn't take that into account and they're literally looking for the at sign. We can do things with CAPTCHAs. CAPTCHA is where you have to identify pieces of an image to prove you're a human. So that's the, click on all of the traffic lights, click on all of the ships type of thing. We can do contact forms. So rather than posting our email publicly, we can have a contact form. Please put your email in so that we can contact you. You just have to make sure you're keeping in mind accessibility and the types of software that are used for that as we're going about any of this process. We can also look at other ways of hiding information besides just email addresses. So we can look at things like our naming policies. So servers are always going to have names, host names, and we can think about things like making them not easily guessable. So if I have a public email server of email03 and I have two private email servers, we can probably make a guess at what my two private email servers are named. So we can think about things like that. Some places will go and have specific naming schemes on some of their hidden servers that are a little bit less descriptive. Of course, that also means you have to document this everywhere because if you have a server that's, let's say, named TARDIS, well, if you're a Doctor Who fan, then you can make some other guesses as to what the other servers might be and what you're going to be looking for and what their function is. But if you're not, that can be a little bit hard. And then, of course, it's not as descriptive, so you can't tell that the TARDIS server was actually the repository of all databases. It's not going to be particularly obvious. When we look at our email addresses, we can see, are the email addresses for the company being posted online? Are they following an obvious naming scheme? So let's say, for example, you have an employee, Jane Doe. It's really common for companies to have things like Jane Doe at company.com, JDoe at company.com, Jane.doe at company.com. And all of those are really common email address patterns. Now, if we've posted our employee list and we have first names and last names of employees, it's a relatively small command that would allow us to go from employee list to all of the common options for email addresses. So one of the things that we can do to sort of combat that issue is we can have more generic emails. This can also be good because we don't have to worry about turnover. If we know the CEO's email is CEO at acmecorp.com, we don't have to necessarily care who the CEO is. That's just the person checking the email. So there's some things we can do there. We can also think about the information that we are showing from the company perspective in terms of, let's say, job descriptions. If you have a job description, are you listing the products that you use, the third parties that you work with, your AV and networking needs? If you are listing all of these, which I mean, to some extent, you kind of have to. If you need people to come in and run, Active Directory because you're a Windows shop, you kind of have to post that you're a Windows shop with Active Directory. So you just want to be aware that that's information that is being shown, but that means it's really easy to guess your setup. So if you're looking for somebody that knows Active Directory and knows, let's say, Windows Server 2016, then it's relatively easy to guess that you're a Windows shop and you're probably using Server 2016 right now. If you have a posting that is asking for somebody to migrate from Server 2012 to 2016, that also gives us information. It means that you were maybe using 2012. You might currently be using it if it's still, the job posting is still available, or you have just set up 2016, in which case maybe you haven't finished all of the patching yet. So these are pieces of information that can be put together to give us a better idea of what's going on at the company. And then from the company perspective, think about what's being shared, can we take it down, and how can we protect against people using this information against us. Now, what you can do here is you can pause me. If you don't have a pair, you're sitting and watching this at home or somewhere else, that's fine. Think about one more thing that you could do to hide info that I haven't mentioned yet. Think about one more thing that you think would be really valuable that I haven't already touched on. Now, DNS for a company. So we had already talked about some of the DNS recon in previous topics. One of the things that a company can do is something called a split DNS. A split DNS is where we can have a DNS for public and a DNS for private. The public should only show the public-facing servers. The private should only show the private-facing servers. And because we have that split, it's not reasonable for a hacker to come in and be able to find some of the private stuff if they only have access to the public DNS. So it's one of the protections that we can give. Another protection we can give is disabling a zone transfer. A zone transfer is where you're replicating the DNS database across a set of servers. This is generally considered a no-no. We don't want to have zone transfers enabled, and most people have it disabled at this point in time. When we're talking about the other side, we always have to think about the people or the wetware. We want to make sure that we are also securing the people in the company. One of the ways that we have to think about this is social engineering. As a company, what do we do as training to prevent social engineering? How well do we communicate this to the employees? And how does our training actually work? So unfortunately, really commonly what you'll see in industry is actually quite a lot of bad trainings, where you'll have, maybe once a year somebody says, hey, don't get socially engineered, read this 30-page form and then click that you agree and you've read it. Now, while that might contain all of the info, I think we can all agree that a 30-page form is probably not the most fun thing to read. So it's worth thinking about different ways to do this training if you're going to be working with a company on this. For example, we could do role playing to show what social engineering might look like. We could show some examples of ways that people might try to socially engineer you and how to avoid it. We could also look at some of the company's security procedures and policies. One of the things that we have to make sure of as a company is that there isn't a disconnect between what we say we're doing and what we're actually doing. If there is a disconnect, we have to look at why. So if a company has a security policy and it has a policy on passwords, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are people following our password policy? If they are not following their password policy, why? Is it us or is it them? Usually the answer is a little bit of both, but it's really important that we think about why policies aren't being followed and what we could do to encourage this to be followed. We want all of our security policies and procedures to be the easiest option so that all other options are harder. It's one of the ways that we can make sure we're trying to be as secure as possible. If we make our policy the hardest option, most people aren't going to volunteer for that. We have to make sure that it's the easiest option to implement. Now, another thing that you'll see really popularly in companies is people using PII as authentication, or these knowledge-based answers. So let's say, for example, one of the things that you'll see commonly is, please enter in your password. Oh, we don't remember you logging in from this device. What was your mother's maiden name? What street did you grow up on? What was the name of your first pet? So all of those are pieces of information that sometimes will get used to prove you are you, but we know that that's actually really a bad way of proving you are you. Even if we look at things like, for example, social media, you've probably seen all of those social media quizzes. 10 things you might not know about me. And that's probably going to have a lot of this information, and people share those things publicly. So it's things that we do have to worry about. Now, when we're talking about systems in a company, we have something called mission critical. Now, a mission critical system is basically a computer or set of computers or mainframe set of mainframes that is vital to the functioning of the company. Anything that is considered vital to the functioning of the company needs to have an extra layer of protection. So let's say, for example, we were working on some really important data for drones. Well, if we're working on really important data for drones, we want all of the programming for these drones to be hidden. We don't want this publicly accessible. So an air-gapped system means that the computer that we are running the drone code on isn't actually connected to the internet, and it's not actually connected to any other computer that is connected to the internet. And it also will have connections disabled. So you can't, for example, take a USB from an internet connected computer and move it over to the drone system, because it doesn't allow you to do that. The only way to actually access the drone system and the drone code and the drone computer is if you physically type something in, because you are sitting there next to it. Those airlocked or air-gapped systems are one of the ways that we can protect some of our most sensitive data, and it's important to have policies around that. You also want to think about how you're doing your employee education. So you want to make sure that you have relatively tech-savvy employees, and you give them frequent trainings, and you also give them the tools that they need to be able to go look up and find information that is important for this. Let's say, for example, most of you have probably Googled yourself at some point. As a company, we might be able to encourage our employees to Google themselves regularly, or set up Google alerts, or see what they're posting. Think about what's being posted publicly. Especially if we're dealing with more sensitive data, it's worth thinking about what is actually being posted and shared publicly from the employees as well as the company as a whole. Now, normally I would do a demo here. I won't be doing this online, but normally I would do a demo of how to spoof a website, so that you could see how easy it is to spoof a website and do some credential harvesting. So a little bit more in depth for vishing, phishing, and smishing training. So phishing is when we are sending email messages to the companies. One of the things that we can do is we can show some sample phishing emails. We can have a phishing email campaign that is sent out to everybody in the company. If they click on it, they get an invite for more training. We can talk to the employees about how email addresses are spoofed, how links are shortened, how attachments can be dangerous, so that we are able to make sure that all of this information is being shared with all of our employees. We can also do things like have vishing training. So vishing is somebody calling you and saying that they would like more information, and socially engineering over the phone. So if you have publicly searchable numbers, those are the employees you're probably going to want to have more vishing training for. So help desk, sales, stuff like that is probably going to have more vishing training than, let's say, your dev shop, because the developers are unlikely to be dealing with customers and having their numbers publicly accessible, whereas the sales force is going to have a lot more contact with customers. Now, some of the common things that you'll see in phishing is things like threats or coercive language. You'll also see this in phishing campaigns. So, these threats and coercive language that gets used in either phishing or vishing is one of the ways that you can have this pressure to make people want to respond to you. So, things that tend to make people really nervous are viruses on a computer, or the IRS is a really common one. The IRS will sue you if you don't respond to this email. This is the IRS. Please confirm this information on the phone. These are things that tend to make people sort of short circuit some of their logic. So it's important that we include some of this in our training, because one of the things we can do to combat this is, let's say we have an example of somebody has called into the sales desk and said, this is the IRS and we're auditing your company. Please confirm this data. If you have the salesperson even just say, let me go discuss with my supervisor, if this was legitimate, they would say, yes, of course, get back to me. But if it's not legitimate, they're going to continue to try to pressure. So having that pause of, let me go check with my supervisor, can sometimes be enough to derail that campaign. Time pressures can also be really popular. So you'll see this in sales tactics. The sale will end in 3 minutes. But you'll also see this, for example, people calling a company right before closing, or right before a long weekend, or right before a shift ends, because at the end of the day, a lot of people are tired and just want to go home. So they might be willing to share more information than they necessarily should. Now, here I have some examples of phishing and smishing. Smishing is FMS, or text message phishing attempts. And you can see some of these examples are going to have things where you can identify some of these time pressures and coercive language, such as your Apple ID is due to expire. We've detected unusual activity. Is this picture you? So that can all be things that can make people really nervous. Your bank account has been suspended. That kind of thing tends to put more pressure on people. You can also see some examples of bad email addresses or links that are going places that isn't really the right place. So, for example, Walmart's URL is not wmartprogram.com. So things like this are ways that we can defeat some of these phishing and smishing style of attacks. Now, we can also look at reducing our digital footprint. One of the things that we saw during the recon process is the amount of things that are publicly available. And so we can look at how we can reduce that. We can look at things like, what are employees saying? What are they saying on their social media? Have they actually made their social media private? What is the company policy on sharing info and intellectual property? Do we have one? If we don't, should we? How are we deleting our old info? How do we archive it? And you can also look at what's called following breadcrumbs. So if we are looking at publicly available data, a lot of people will actually show a lot more information than they might necessarily realize they're showing on things like social media and internet accounts. And so if you are linking to some of these old accounts in some unexpected ways, it can be easy to follow that path. If you're interested in more information about that, there was actually an example of this in the news where the old founder of the Silk Road, which was a website trafficking in illegal goods, was actually caught because they posted some code for help publicly under an old screen name, and they were able to track back from that screen name and connect that screen name to the actual person that was behind a lot of the programming for that original Silk Road. So that's the kind of thing where we can sort of do that track back. Now, normally I would do an activity, but for online, what I'm going to say is pause me and go look at your digital footprint. See what you can find about yourself online. Do you have any alerts set up? Should you have any alerts set up? And I would also like to remind you, don't just Google your name and call it good. think about all of the things that you know of how to get more information out of search engines and think about how you could look for more information about you using those skills. Now, as we are talking about this from the company perspective, we are going to be doing something called system hardening. System hardening is where we are trying to protect our systems from outside interference. So when we talked about before Nmap and Zenmap as a way of mapping out the system, we can look at system hardening as how we are defeating that. So what ports do we have open? Do we still need to have them all open? What services do we have running? Do we still need to have it running? Is there anything that we are no longer using that we could get rid of? How are we patching our systems? What is our policy behind that? How are we controlling this? How often do we actually do these audits? And then we can also do some security checkups. For example, in Linux, you can actually use something called Linus, and it will give you a report on your server to see where you might have some vulnerabilities. This is an automated report that is pretty easy to run. It's free. And this is some of what we can do to look at what we could do to make our systems more secure. Firewalls can also help with this. Firewalls are how we can direct traffic, so we can send some information out into, let's say, the DMZ, so that we are protecting some of our more valuable assets. There's a topic on firewalls. If you would like to learn more about firewalls right now, you can go look at that topic and hear more about firewalls and how they end up actually working. Now, we can talk about policies and procedures. So, as we are talking about the way that our systems are set up, we have company policies, which is the rules that we have, and then we have to think about how these rules are being enforced. So, one of the things that all companies should do are security audits. You can see there's actually an entire topic of how to do a security audit. The idea behind an audit is that we are going through all of our rules with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that they are still useful and relevant. We can have policies on device management. So, for example, is this company a bring your own device or BYOD? Do we have some variety of rules set up? A lot of companies that deal with more sensitive data will actually do things like have a locker set up so that we can put our phones or cameras or whatever it is in the locker before we actually are getting to the campus to give a little bit more protection. Companies should have password policies and password controls. What is the password policy? What is the rules? How long do they have to be? Do they have any special character requirements? How do you do shared passwords? Who's holding the master password? How is this being changed? How is this being updated? Who's backing up the passwords? Who's our backup of our backup to make sure that we don't lose access to a system? And all of these policies, procedures, and everything needs to have plans, backups, and backups of the backups. At no point during our security policy should we have that person. So we need to make sure that if one person, they call this hit by a bus, it's a little crude, but the idea is if one person isn't there that day, they are sick, they transfer jobs, whatever it happens to be, what's our backup policy? Because if we have, let's say, for example, a master password for the servers that's only given to the system administrator. The system administrator is out on vacation for 2 days and they don't have access to their phone and one of the systems goes down. Well, you can't necessarily expect somebody to be on call 24/7, 365. So, what's the backup? Who's the backup administrator? Who has a backup of that password? Who has a backup of these systems? Who do we go to when they're on vacation? It's always important to make sure that you have some set of redundancy within the company so that you don't ever end up getting stuck in a situation where everything is reliant on a single person. So that was the end of the other side. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you all have a lovely day.